Hey guys, it's M. Please don't skip this, I just want to say this. This is going to be a compilation of all my Dark Souls videos. At the end of each of the videos, I'm going to give my post thoughts, some little things that I got wrong or I want to correct a little bit, and how I feel about the games now, after a year has passed since these reviews. With that out of the way, I'll hand it over to Past Me. We're going to be reviewing Dark Souls 1, the first of the trilogy. Now, funnily enough, I never actually intended on reviewing this game. The main reason I wanted to review 2 and 3 was because I played a ton of those games and wanted to talk about them. Dark Souls 1, while I did play it, I played it significantly less than the other 2 in the series. When I initially got the game, I beat it once, then started playing it for a second time and stopped halfway. Now, years later, having reviewed the other 2, I felt I had to review it to finish off the trilogy. So as always, in preparation, I beat the game again, going out of my way to experience almost everything I hadn't before. And let me tell you, this video is going to be an experience for both of us. 2 things before we start. At times I will be comparing things to the other 2 titles. I felt I would be babying this game if I didn't do this, as I feel by itself, it's good enough on its own where I don't need to coddle it by saying for the time before I make any point. Of course I'll give it its for the time credits where they're due, but we live in an age where multiple Dark Souls games now exist, and I'm going to be talking about it from that viewpoint. Second, as I always say, I'm not going to be blindly praising this game or hating it. I'm just here to give my opinion on it, and that's it. Now, with all that being said, let's begin. Dark Souls 1's world is very interesting. Literally every location is visually distinct and memorable in its own ways. If you've played this game, I'm pretty sure you could name these locations the moment you see them. They all have distinct themes to separate themselves from each other, and I quite like that. I didn't even notice how evident it was until my replay for this video. This is a great and pretty much crucial detail, since unlike the other 2, you can't fast travel until the second half of the game, meaning you have to go through these areas multiple times throughout your playthrough. Now some may say this is annoying as you have to waste your time walking through areas you've already been through over and over again. Don't get me wrong, it definitely does feel like that at times, but the trade for that is you really get to appreciate this world and all the ways around it, which is a unique aspect I feel I haven't seen in many other games. The game's world by itself isn't large enough to the point where it feels unmanageable. It's all pretty tightly made, and it won't take you long to remember pathways in and out of these areas. This also helped me notice something else, how valuable shortcuts are. Before I played any Dark Souls game, I had seen some review praising the shortcuts. Then I got my hands on 2 and 3 and I didn't even see what was so amazing about them. Sure, they were helpful, but acting like it was some crazy amazing feature felt a bit ridiculous to me. Then you play 1 and it immediately makes sense. As I said, you go through these areas time and time again, so figuring out and finding shortcuts is super valuable to you in your journey. It's rewarding to go through an entire area, unlock the shortcut, then know you can skip a large portion of the map on your way back. It's a very unique feature I've never really seen matter so much in any other game, and it really helps this stand out against the others in the series. You could argue the late game fast travel ruins this game, but I feel like it's introduced at the perfect spot in the playthrough, as this is where the world's really opened up and walking between both ends of the map would be unbearable. Now, do I have some issues with the areas themselves? Some, but they aren't things you haven't heard before. Lost Izalith sucks and it feels like it was made by a toddler, copying and pasting the same enemy over and over again to compensate for the fact that there's nothing there. Blighttown isn't great. When you have it memorized, you can get down it quickly, but if not, it feels like a nightmare. Sen's Fortress, while the least annoying out of the areas I've mentioned so far, it's definitely not a place I love going through due to all its traps and intentionally annoyingly placed enemies. And whoever decided to hide a bonfire near a ledge a normal person wouldn't even look down on their playthrough is genuinely an awful human being. Duke's Archives feels like horde mode at times, and the way to the Great Hollow is stupid, and I'm almost positive you wouldn't figure out how to get into this area without Googling. But even though I don't love those, the few isn't enough to drag down the majority of this game. This is going to be an odd point. Now when I say this, I mean this in an entirely different way than I did in my video for Dark Souls 2. You see, in Dark Souls 1, it feels like they have you in a lot more cutscenes than they did in 2 and 3. Or at least a lot more that directly feature you in shot. There aren't many that don't, and as dumb as it sounds, it's just nice to see your character show up in all these scenes. It helps immerse you in the world. Most of 2's cutscenes, you weren't even in the shot. Despite 3 having the best boss fights and graphics where you'd love to see your character interact with the boss in some sort of way, you're only in shot for like a handful of them, and even in those you're only there for about a few seconds at most. Here, it feels like you really get to see your character make it through this unforgiving world. And as for one little add-on to this point about your character, I really love the animations for when you're under the stat requirement. Watching your character stumble around when swinging the weapon or fumbling it into a block makes you feel a tangible change when your character can use them properly later, or show how out of their element they are when using other weapons outside of the norm. Builds in DS1 are probably the most impactful when compared to 2 and 3. For starters, you can't redo your stats. While this objectively kinda sucks for an RPG, and especially so in the Souls series, since every other game in the trilogy lets you do this, it does lead to your stat choice having a lot more weight, as you can't just undo it if you dislike them. When you get your build focused on one or two things, the creative freedom here is interesting, due to a few aspects. There's a lot less magic in this game in comparison to the other two, due to it being the first, but most magics here tend to be pretty amazing, doing a lot of damage and being able to destroy most normal enemies in one hit, sometimes even multiple enemies. I definitely used it a lot more here than I did in 2 and 3, as even though it feels simpler, it seems a lot more effective. Then to break them down a little bit, let's talk about Pyromancy, Faith, and Sorcery by themselves, because I find them very interesting here. Pyromancy doesn't scale with anything, at all. You just upgrade it with souls and it gets stronger. It doesn't require any specific resource like the Fire Seed in 2 or even Titanite like 3. Now initially I thought it was going to end up sucking because, as I said, it doesn't scale. And most things that don't scale in Souls games tend to be kinda bad. But here it feels like if you keep leveling it, normally it does more than a generous amount of damage. It never really fell behind the rest of my main damage types. If anything, it was slightly above them. And as for Sorcery and Faith, none of the magic catalysts level at all. They just scale off of your stats, which is jarring coming off of 2 and 3. It feels really good to pick up a better catalyst or just level your stats and see an immediate difference in your damage. All three pathways I mentioned are extremely viable, but what about Strength and Dex? Dex feels pretty standard and in line with 2 and 3. Fast, lightweight weapons that usually do bleed or some other status effect. It's strong, but nothing really outside of the norm. Strength, however, kind of feels like easy mode here. If you get a large weapon, you can shart out damage, most likely insta-killing normal enemies and doing crazy damage to bosses. And as we'll get to, bosses aren't exactly lightning fast and can stagger here, meaning you'll be able to beat most of them quickly. Then let's get into equipment load, because it's a very build-defining feature in this game. In 2 and 3, most of the time you can't even tell if you're medium or light roll. They look almost identical, and to most people who haven't looked deep into iframes, you wouldn't be able to tell any difference. In DS1, it's immediately evident what equip load you're at. For those of you who have played the other games, the light roll in DS1 is pretty much the medium roll in the other two games. Your quick snappy roll that will get you out of trouble. The medium roll here is kinda gross feeling. It's functional, but the end lag isn't great. Then there's the heavier fat roll, which if you've played the other games, you know what this is. The chunky roll you shouldn't be using, as you should have a substitute for it, like a shield or high poise. Replaying for this review, I forgot how tangible the difference was between roll types, meaning I had to adjust my build accordingly to which kind of roll I wanted. It does add a little bit of weight management I didn't feel in the other games, and as I said at the start, it really makes you feel like the way you build your character affects a lot about how you play the game. Somewhat similar to DS2, DS1 has a lot of unique features that simply didn't transfer to any of the other games somehow. While not as many, I feel I should point them out. Tail cutting. While it's not necessarily unique to this game, the way it's executed is. Every boss with a tail in this game is able to have it cut off, making it drop some of the most unique weapons in the game. Ignoring the literal weapon reward aspect of this feature, it feels really great to just cut an entire limb off of a boss with a blood splatter, further emphasizing the damage that you've done to it. Kindling. Kindling is a very unique feature. For the few of you who don't know, the amount of Estus you had wasn't controlled by Estus shards. If you were at a normal bonfire, you'd get 5, but if you were at a bonfire with a Firekeeper, you could get 10. Which kinda goes back into my area point, as this helps you emphasize your checkpoints throughout the world. But after you beat Pinwheel, you unlock the option to kindle bonfires, letting you sacrifice a humanity to boost your amount of Estus to a max of 20 for one bonfire. This may sound broken out of context, but in this game, it isn't so much that running out of Estus will be your problem. It'll more so be not getting melted in a matter of seconds due to some bad choices you made. So this will very rarely make a super huge game-changing difference unless you're running something like a tank build. And I feel like I have to slip this point somewhere in this video. The armor sets here look amazing. This point is subjective, so I'll try to keep it short, but they just look really good. All the way from the start where you're patching your armor together with what you can find, to the end of the game where you can select from anything, it's kind of a challenge to make your character look dumb by accident. And what I find interesting about this is quite a few of the unique sets in this game never left it somehow. Things like the Boar's helmet piece, Chester's armor, the crystal armor, etc. In this regard, this game is right under DS2 for me. Now we get into the more nuanced things. If you talk to most people about this game, they'll say Dark Souls is known for its absolutely amazing boss fights, with great designs and skillful combat. While I'll say DS1's bosses have the most unique designs in the series in my opinion, amazing boss fights is a stretch. For the time, I'd most likely agree. When FromSoft just released DS1, these bosses were way different from normal game or normal RPG bosses. They require a level of skill and commitment most other games don't, because they can kill you in a matter of seconds if you make a single mistake. Now we have two other main games to base the boss quality on. And if we extend even further to the other FromSoft games in general, we have tons of bosses to compare this to. And to be blunt, a majority of DS1 bosses aged poorly. Are they downright horrible? No, but to say they hold up against the other FromSoft bosses is a reach. In my personal opinion, many of them aren't really far off from Dark Souls 2. Here, most of them are clunky and can hardly turn around, with pretty easy to avoid attacks. On my replay of this game for this video, I first tried a majority of the bosses because even though I forgot their entire movesets, they aren't really challenging, to the point where a good chunk of them aren't even worth discussing. Now, are there unique encounters? Sure. This game has a few of them that deviate from your standard fight. Now, are all of them good? No, not really. Belfry gargoyles are neat. Their health was extremely low when I fought them with my knife, but I enjoy them. You've heard everyone gush about ONS, so I won't do the same. But in short, I think they may have the second or third best duo fighting FromSoft history. Only under Demon Princes and a little under Frida's second phase. But now for the bosses I have more extreme feelings towards, Nito is annoying. When you get him by himself, he's really easy. But his little respawning skeletons feel like they only exist to poke at you. And with the only way to permakill them being a holy weapon, something a majority of players won't just have on hand, it's this annoying game of killing the skeletons then hitting Nito in your free few seconds. In my replay of this game, I got annoyed enough by the skeletons to make a divine weapon to kill them. And when I did, I immediately shit on Nito for how simple his moveset is. Everyone's heard about how bad Bed of Chaos is, so I'm not gonna elaborate much, but yeah, stupid gimmick boss with insta-kill holes. Seath is aggravating for a few reasons. First, in his original encounter, you can't kill him at all. This isn't really communicated to the player. When I went through this game originally, I remember dying to him. Assumed I did the wrong thing since no one else in this game works like this, and I went back to his room to die again. After about 3 attempts, I just looked it up because I was about to cut the game off. You could argue, well, he's on a little bump and this should have been obvious. But you can also fight this boss after Bed of Chaos, which I feel is all I need to say. Then there's cutting his tail. Now, Seath is a wide fella. Getting behind him in itself is hard due to the fact he has 2 more tail-like things besides him. But disregarding that, you can only hit the tippy-tip end of his tail or else it won't come off. No other boss in this game works like this, and you'd have no reason to think of only hitting the end of it. I spent far more time on this replay than I'd like to admit trying to break his tail, because I didn't want to Google things. But then I eventually caved in. To say I was angry is a bit of an understatement. Then the fight itself, ignoring that, is interesting. Like I said earlier, if you try to go to his sides, due to his tail's ridiculous size and collision, you'll get body blocked by him constantly if you try to go anywhere but his front. Then if you are behind him, his tail swipes are nigh impossible to dodge unless you're really far from him, as he takes up about half of the arena. And then his tail's hitbox is something. I don't know if you guys saw the short I posted, but if we stick to focusing on his front, this fight is really easy. His moves are slow and just lead to a lot of scrambling away from him, then walking back and whacking him. He's not exactly what I'd call a riveting boss. Gwyn's fight is held together by chewed up gum and paper. I feel if you've played this game, we all know about parrying him to death. And the reason everyone does it is because it's significantly easier than fighting him regularly because he sharts out damage. If he hits you with a majority of his moveset, it does half health for 1 hit. Now this wouldn't be too much of a problem if he didn't have this one immediate slash move with no tell at all. I'm sure even the people who parry him to death know exactly what I'm talking about. The rest of his moveset is fairly standard, but this one move is so fast, sometimes it can chain off of his other moves and you have no way to evade it. And even if he does it raw, you have no way to react to this in time. It's the one thing that makes me feel like this fight was balanced by a child. The rest of it is pretty fair, and then it's immediately ruined by this one unfair move. Now for the DLC bosses. Priscilla's easy. She kind of fits into the same clump of forgettable and everything but design boss fights for me. But the Ulasil bosses, these are something else. Sanctuary Guardian on my first playthrough was easy with my strength build. I hardly remembered the fight, but on my replay, he was actually kind of fun. In my other Dark Souls videos, I've said for the first and second games, there's only 3 or so good bosses and they're both at the end of them. And honestly, I wish I included the Sanctuary Guardian in there. A majority of the bosses in this Ulasil area kind of match 3's boss fights. Fast, snappy encounters, and he fits that description. His damage feels fair as only his slower attacks do about half or more than half health. His combos become dodgeable after you get hit once, but you need to time it right or else he'll catch you. Overall, I think he's amazing. Artorias is kind of the same. Fun, fast, and unique. But there's one problem I have with him, and it's not really the fault of his moveset. You see, Artorias and more so Manus have high magic, lightning, and fire resist. As a Dex Faith build with a lightning infusion and Quilag's sword, I could practically deal no real damage to this boss. Ignoring the fact that there isn't any respec here, getting the resources to re-level my sword wasn't in the cards, so I just had to deal with it for him. I'm gonna dig a bit more into this later, but him being nigh immune to my build messed with my enjoyment of him. But everything else about him is great. He might even be the best boss in DS1 in my opinion. Now, Manus is interesting. Manus again is like the others. Fun, fast, well-telegraphed attacks, decently sized openings, the works. Ignoring the whole nigh immune to magic and faith thing, since we just went over that, my only problem with his fight by itself is one move in particular, his combo. Now for the chunky shield fellas, I doubt this is a problem, but for lighter medium equipped characters, this is the bane of your existence. The tell for this move is him screaming for half of a second before flailing wildly around. Depending on how close you are to him, this will just outright kill you. If you're right up next to him, it's impossible to get away from this move in time, as the gap from him telling the move and him doing it aren't enough for you to get a safe distance. And similar to the Soul of Cinder in 3, if this move starts, it's a chain. The counterplay to this is to mostly hit things like his hand and not his body, as his hand is far enough away from him where you can run a safe distance if he tries to start this move. Which, while a fine counter in itself, I wish this move was tweaked just slightly so the tell was a bit longer. Even Gale's non-chaining flurry attack gives you more warning than this. Then there's Calamite. The boss I've heard is touted as one of the best, and some people told me I should have included him as one of the top bosses in my other Souls videos. I'll admit I hadn't fought Calamite until my replay for this review, and I was disappointed. Sure, it's a better fight than a majority of the bosses I beat first try, but I beat him in 2 tries. When I mentioned I was disappointed with him in my community tab, someone told me I have to think about how impactful it was for the time, which is true. But at the same time, now we have multiple dragon bosses, and he felt like the easiest out of the big 3 for me, with the other 2 being Sin and Medivh. Calamite's moveset is pretty limited and very easy to dodge. His damage isn't as high as Artorias or Manus even if you do mess up, and he just ended up not being that memorable to me. I didn't even get hit with his cool Calamity attack as I avoided it by accident. As I said, he's above average by DS1 standards, but in today's world, he's not much to speak about. But moving away from them individually, what else do all the bosses, even the ones I'm not going to be discussing here, have in common? Boss runbacks. And let me tell you, I don't enjoy any of them. They're all the right amount of distance to be irritating on your 3rd or so try. The few bosses I did have to redo didn't annoy me that much by themselves, but the minute or so walk back every time was brain numbing. Just inconvenient enough to be annoying. For a great example, I'd love to fight Gwen legitimately without parrying him to death, but that walk back has always made me reconsider every time I've played this game. I'm not even gonna sugarcoat it. A majority of my frustration with this game came from the enemies or enemy placement. The start of the game isn't so bad, as you're mostly fighting hollows. But once you reach Blighttown, Londo, and onwards, yeah, I was ready to snap my controller in half a few times. DS3 enemies for the most part don't matter. You can pretty much ignore them. DS2 enemies don't usually become a threat unless you get trapped in a scenario where you have to fight multiple of them at the same time. Their attacks were slow and obvious, and most of them didn't do much damage, so the only way they posed a threat to you is if you skipped a clump of them and then you got stuck in a group combo. Here, it feels like almost every enemy no matter what would hit me for half or more health. The Duke's Archives was a goddamn nightmare because of this. The little crystal guys are monsters. If you get hit twice and can't heal, you can get destroyed in moments. New Londo has ghosts that can flow through walls and have long arms. There were points where I was getting hit and I couldn't even tell where I was getting hit from. And again, that wouldn't be so bad if they weren't taking chunks of you every time they hit you. Some enemies like Dark Wraiths can combo you, but keep in mind, as I said before, you usually die in 2 or so hits, so they can just insta-kill you with this combo. Bone Wheels legitimately made me want to commit murder. I know it's a joke in the community how bad they are, so I won't harp on this point too much, but whoever made the cramped tunnel with the Bone Wheels and Aramis, I hope you stub your toe on your bed hard when you try to go to sleep. Same with the person who decided to put these 3 respawning demons in front of the giant blacksmith. And whoever made the Titanite demons, because fighting those things up close is a nightmare. Moving off of the enemies by themselves, there's just some overall irritating placement like I said before. Like the mice hidden in boxes near Gaping Dragon's area. Or the multiple times the game will just stick an enemy behind a corner you can't fully see. Now, are all the enemies annoying? No, of course not. But the cases where they are here happen to be really bad. Near the end of the game, I was so exhausted with the enemies, I legitimately almost stopped replaying the game and was going to do the rest of this review from memory. When people say the end half of this game drags more than the first, the enemies felt like the main reason for me. They're just so numerous and have so many half-health attacks. I died to them more than any of the bosses. And something I need to slip in before we move on is chain backstabs. See, the enemies here are so clunky when it comes to turning, if you get one backstab off, you can just run behind them and backstab them again. This straight up trivializes one-on-one encounters with certain enemies like the Silver Knights or Dark Wraiths. It's such a weird quirk in only this game, I felt I had to bring it up. Just a quick pause from the video for a moment. As a small YouTuber, if this video interests you in any way, shape, or form, a like and a subscribe would be very much appreciated. I'm trying to hit 1K by the end of the year, and you can help out with that. Anyways, back to the video. Now, hitboxes in Dark Souls have always been a bit divisive. DS2's hitboxes are infamous, and DS3's, while better and no one seems to mention them, do have a few issues as well. DS1 has a few problems with them too. I've seen quite a few things just go through me or someone else, but also a lot of times I felt like I get hit by something nowhere near me. This was mainly a problem in Duke's Archives. Then there'd be a good amount of times where the hitbox or collision of the creature is wider than it itself. So trying to run past some of those enemies, I get completely body blocked despite the fact it looks like I shouldn't be able to. Then there are lingering hitboxes, which are pretty tricky here. This seems to often be a problem with projectiles, I noticed. If you try and straight roll through them, which is pretty easy in the other games, you'll often get hit with the back end of the ability, which is a bit upsetting. Still not done with this point, there's a bit of hitbox shoving. It's a weird thing I've never really noticed in the other games, but with a lot of the stubbier or larger enemies, sometimes they'll do a turn and your character will be shoved in an entirely different spot. This is mostly a bit of chaos problem, but it happened to me a few times. Honestly, if you want a single enemy that embodies most of my problems with hitboxes and collision in this game, you could just fight a Titanite demon. Overall, hitboxes aren't a super prominent issue here, but it reared its head quite a few times during my playthrough. While in my DS2 and 3 videos, this didn't happen much. DS1 controls a lot like DS3, but a bit worse. Let me explain. DS1 controls are nice, smooth, and responsive, all up until you hit the little lock-on button. Then you can only roll in 4 directions. Even after trying to desperately think how this would make any sort of sense, I can't think of a single scenario where you'd want to do this. So I intentionally went out of my way to not use the lock-on except when I needed to aim miracles or something like that. Is this game ruining? No, not at all. As someone who played Monster Hunter, I don't really mind shifting the camera around to find the boss. That being said, it's such a weird problem only this game has. This is an interesting point, mainly because I never felt I had to do it before. I remember one time in my Elden Ring video, I said I never had to grind levels in Dark Souls, which is true. 3 and 2 I never needed to, and in 1 my first character was a pure strength girl with a club and power within, so I didn't feel the need to grind for anything at all. My weapon wasn't even maxed the first time I beat this game. Circling back to this playthrough though, I definitely needed to grind due to a few things I mentioned earlier, such as my weapons being useless against Manus and Artorias. Those fights forced me to undo my lightning weapon and level them normal, but I didn't have enough to max them. This, combined with the fact there isn't a merchant that sells you everything to max out your weapon, led to me grinding until I could get my weapon to plus 15, which wasn't necessarily a fun thing to do. And the worst part was, I didn't know Manus was immune to literally everything except basic damage types, since you're not really informed of what bosses are resistant to until you hit them. So I made an occult weapon that did near no damage to them, and had to reset that too before coming to the realization to make a normal plus 15. The second example I have with grinding in this game is with boss or special weapons. As I came into this replay pretty much blind, having forgot a lot of what I did in my first playthrough, I found 2 cool weapons I wanted to use: Quilag's sword and the Demon Spear. I wanted to use both of them, so I began leveling them simultaneously. Near the mid-game, I was confused on why I couldn't find any more Demon Titanite, and this was because, unknown to me, there isn't many of them in this game in general, or an enemy to kill to get more of them. Meaning at the point I was at, unless I googled all the locations and followed the guide to a T, those weapons just weren't going to be maxed in this playthrough. So after I got my plus 15 katana to fight against Manus, I just benched these weapons and didn't use them, despite the fact I really wanted to. And 2, I feel you're on level, if not over leveled with all your gear due to how much stuff this game shoves at you. And by the end of the game, you could buy all the Titanite resources you wanted in Marjula from Cloan. And 3, since it was so linear, finding the things needed to level wasn't so bad. And by the end game, just like 2, you could buy everything. It seems like this was a problem they fixed in the following titles, but it's interesting to see this kind of scenario could happen here. And just for 2 small additions: Dragon Scales. No idea why they insisted on making it so annoying to get these in 1 and 2, but since it's also used to upgrade some weapons in this game, I think it's a bit worse here. I'm kind of happy 3 just ditched the entire Covenant aspect of letting you turn into a dragon and pick up the transformations, because getting these, especially 50 of them, just isn't fun. The same thing goes for the Sunlight Medallions. As a Faith build, I'm sure you can assume I wanted a better Lightning Spear, but in this game, and only this game, it's locked behind Solaire's Covenant rewards for both variants. And if you don't want to play the game online, the only way to get them is to farm them from Chaos Bugs for a 3% drop. So as you can imagine, I just dealt with it and used the normal Lightning Spear the entire game. Usually this is where the complaint segment goes, but people don't tend to complain much about DS1 other than saying it's too hard, so I'm not aware of many of the more nuanced things people say about it. So in exchange for that, I'm gonna bring up things I couldn't fit into any other section. Embers. I found it annoying the way they hit embers, mainly the occult and large ones. I wouldn't mind if they were similar to the ashes in Dark Souls 3 that let the person you gave them to sell the resource, but for the simple feature of just leveling up your weapon to max? This is the main reason I never maxed out any of my weapons in my first playthrough. I legitimately never found either of these. I'm less mad about the occult ember seeing as it's not part of the main upgrade path, but hiding it down a well in a tunnel with bone wheels for a key, which you then need to use to open a door to fight more enemies, was unpleasant to say the least. NPCs. If you remember my other videos, I said the NPCs in 2 are mostly meh, except for a few, and in 3 they're all pretty good. In Dark Souls 1, it leads more to the DS2 side of things. Sure, we have Solaire, Quilina, Lautrec, and Segmire, but the rest are just kinda there. I can't really say I love the chunk of the NPCs this time around. And while this is a normal thing in FromSoft games, some of the character quests were just stupid. Solaire's kill all the maggots below or else he dies was one of the dumbest questline beats I've ever seen. I genuinely have no idea why you would do that regularly. The DLC is fairly obtuse to reach. In comparison to the other 2 games, I think it's insane how they figured you'd learn this. The worst examples of area unlocks in the previous games were most likely getting to Nameless King's area, which is a side area, so I don't particularly mind that, and DS2's DLC key, which is hidden on a cliff edge guarded by giants in a cave in one of the darkest areas of the game. This one admittedly is pretty bad. But then you look up the steps to reach this game's DLCs and it feels like you're performing a COD Easter egg. Explaining any of them would extend this video's length by a good few minutes. But to keep it short, I wasn't even sure Dark Souls Remastered came with the DLCs with how cryptic it was to get into any of them. There aren't any boss faith weapons at all. I think this is a real shame because DS1 has my favorite looking weapons in general out of all 3 games. But during the replay I did for this video, I could hardly use any of these interesting weapons because none of them scaled with the stats I had. My main saving grace was having Dex, as it feels like Faith was made for just miracle casting. Meanwhile, the literal opposite of my build, Intelligent Strength, gets something like the Moonlight Greatsword. Dark Souls 1 feels like the Dark Souls of Dark Souls games, if that makes sense. It's hard in nigh every aspect. Sometimes the word fair doesn't even feel applicable, but it works somehow. While I'm sure you've noticed I've had problems with parts of this game, there isn't a single aspect I can say was flat out done bad with little redeeming qualities. For everything I disliked about it, there was another part I did like. I dislike a good bit of the areas near the second half, but the first halves were really good. And even those second half areas I dislike, I found some parts of them genuinely interesting. I dislike some aspects about how the weapons were handled in this game, but those weapons in themselves are my favorite out of the trilogy. I don't care for most of the NPCs here, but Solaire is a literal icon. This is the most conflicted I feel I've felt about any game. It pissed me off multiple times during my replay. To the point when I beat it, I said I was never gonna play it again. But then I ended up playing a bit of New Game afterwards as a part of me just wanted a bit more of it. It just has this undeniable charm. Like, not all the pieces are perfectly in place, but it's close enough that they still fit. As I said at the end of my DS3 video, 2 shifted into the adventure aspect and 3 focused on combat. But 1 is this weird middle ground between both games. It does neither of what those games did as well as they did, but it's in this sweet in-between of combat and RPG mechanics. And I assume that's why people love this game so much and still cling on to it even after having 2 other games to play with. It does what it did so interestingly that it holds up pretty well on its own, even now. I'd still recommend people go back and give it a try, and I wouldn't be surprised if those people felt the same way as me, or just fell in love with it. Which is really interesting to say about a more than decade-old game with multiple derivatives, as I feel not many originals have the same sort of lasting power. While it's not my personal favorite, the love and critical acclaim Dark Souls 1 gets feels well-deserved. But regardless, what do you guys think? As always, as long as you're respectful, I'm glad to discuss with you in the comments, and I've been out, and I am out. With this one, I said Aramis was DLC because I thought it was. Given how complicated it is to reach Aramis, I just kind of assumed that it was. Because I was like, there's no way that they expected anyone to just be playing this game and find this out. Like, this had to be a post thing, right? Especially since the only thing I could compare it to difficulty-wise was, like, getting to Manus and all them in Ulasil. Oh, and since Ariandel was DLC, I was just like, okay, well, snowy place, also complicated. That matches the Dark Souls 1 DLC. This has to be DLC, and it just wasn't. Probably wouldn't have made the Manus point today. I just don't think it
was needed for me to go, yeah, you know, the Manus combo, the broken, annoying, little slippery, slimy Manus combo. If only it had a half more wind up. I think it can be a little annoying, but I don't think I needed to make it like an entire point in the video. The Titanite demon not respawning, so there is one that respawns. Someone broke it down for me in the comments, and it doesn't seem intentional the way that it is. So I don't blame Past Me for getting this wrong, but I technically am wrong on that. There was a boss faith weapon in Ornstein's Spear. The only reason I overlooked this is because even when playing casually, I tend to kill Super Smo last anyways. I know most people go like, oh, well, that's the sweat tactic because Super Ornstein is a little bit more difficult than Super Smo. Ornstein just happens to be in front of me more, so I usually just end up killing him. I clean forgot that it was a weapon in the game, so that's my fault. How do I feel about Dark Souls 1 now? It is still probably my least favorite to normally play. I don't think I feel as annoyed by it like I did initially in that video, because I did manage to construct it really well, but like, if you heard me playing Dark Souls 1, mainly from Lord Vessel onwards, I was losing my mind. I was going absolutely insane. Now, I've been kind of replaying it because I needed footage for the last videos that went up. I think I still wouldn't just casually hop on Dark Souls 1. If I had it memorized the way I have 2 and 3, then maybe, but it's just like, I don't know. I'm very comfortable with Dark Souls 1 being a game that I've beat a few times, but I'm not gonna go like, okay, where's my fallback comfort game? I don't think it can be that for me. I just think there's a little too much that was handled a little too weird for me to say that. Like, the bosses, I don't really care about them. The builds, I think the builds are cool, but the fact that I can't respec kind of bugs me. The end half, I can't be bothered most of the time. It's the bed of chaos. Like, nah, it's just, a lot of stuff just wasn't where I wish it was yet. In the later games, thankfully, kind of pushed towards more of what I liked in certain regards. I think Dark Souls 1 is just like a nice, it's weird to say it about the first game, but it's like the nice blend in between 3 and 2, where it kind of has stuff that both of those games has, but it doesn't do the stuff as well. Like, I'm not gonna say, oh, Dark Souls 1's action is as good as Dark Souls 3. I don't think that. I think Dark Souls 3 probably has the best action out of the 3 games. But Dark Souls 2 has the best RPG stuff out of the 3 games for me. So, like, Dark Souls 1 has both of those aspects, but I don't think it did it as well as either of those. It's cool. It's a cool little game, but you probably won't see me just hopping on it.
I really like Dark Souls 2. I know this is a controversial take in the Souls community. Honestly, what isn't? But DS2 is probably one of my favorite games, period. It's a comfort game I fall back on anytime I want to play something but can't think of anything else. I've attempted to make this script far more times than I'd care to admit, but I really want to talk about this game. It's not perfect, but I love it so much, I feel like I just have to. Just to clarify, this video isn't going to be me blindly defending DS2 or engaging with many arguments people put against it, because most of it's subjective. Because some parts I like about it, people just hate, and no matter how many words I can put in this script, I'm most likely not going to change their minds. I'm just going to talk about why I like the game, despite how different it is from the others in the series. The areas in DS2 are visually amazing. I've played a lot of games, and I can't think of any others where I stopped and looked at the scenery as many times as I have in this one. And the weirdest part is, I'm not even a graphics guy. It's more of an add-on thing to the experience, kind of like how music is. Something you notice if it's bad, but if it's average, it's more of a passing thing. But the visual direction was so good here, I couldn't help but stop and look over the world multiple times. Then there's the levels themselves, which every time I play this game, I feel like I find some weird new way to interact with the world. Brightstone Cell Door is an area infested with spiders. You're first introduced to them in a dark cave, which most people's natural reaction would be to light a torch, or maybe light the thing in the middle of the room. If you do this, you'll find out that the spiders are afraid of torches and won't attack you if you're holding one, leading to this trait where if you don't want to fight the spiders in this area, you don't have to, but you'd have to hold a torch, which means you can't two-hand or dual-wield your weapons. This effect even carries over to the boss fight, meaning if you hold the torch, you won't have to deal with any of the surrounding spiders, but your damage against the boss will be drastically reduced. Something similar goes for No Man's Wharf. They have these dark creatures near the top of the map that hide from all the lights below. If you have a torch, they'll cower in fear and back away from you. Then there's other mechanics I could get into, like explosive barrels or poison barrels. In the Forest of Giants, you'll come across these areas that are littered with explosive barrels and people throwing firebombs down at you in an attempt to blow you up. Now, if you're an average player, you just try to run past them without exploding. But if you think for a moment, you can shoot the barrels yourself or throw something at them to make them blow up on the enemies. There's a lot of big brain smart moments you can have that reward you for not just being good at the combat, but actually paying attention to your surroundings. And what I've mentioned is just the tip of the iceberg. I could mention the NPC phantoms that'll guide you to side areas and emote when you succeed, blowing up walls to reveal secret areas, lighting the oil monsters' puddles on fire, but if I go into all these small amazing things that this game does just off of the areas, we would be here all day. All these aspects together give you the feeling that you're really on a journey across this fantasy world. DS3 and 1 have those feelings too, but due to those games compromising bigger levels for less of them, alongside the fact that they don't have the same level of interactivity this game's did, it's not really a fair comparison in that regard. And all this alongside the fact that this game is huge. There's so many areas to explore. It's pretty much the closest we got to an open world Dark Souls without going straight open world like Elden Ring did, which I'm personally more of a fan of. Then alongside all of that, this is the only Souls game that runs at a buttery smooth 60 frames per second, which sounds very nerdy but is really noticeable in comparison to 1 and 3's 30 frames. And right before I get off of this point, somewhat still related to the world are the NPCs. DS1 and 3's points where the world is dying due to the fading of the first flame. Multiple NPCs end up dead by the end of both games. It's meant to hammer in that something needs to change. In 1, it's mostly focusing on continuing the cycle, while 3 focuses on needing a new one, as the Age of Fire has been extended for far too long. 2 doesn't really revolve around the flame. It revolves around solving the undead curse. We do lose a few NPCs along the way, but this in itself isn't a world-ending event, so there's a lot more NPCs alive at the end of this game. It gives you a glimmer of hope, that even though everything else sucks, you've helped guide all these people here that are just trying to solve their own problems, or just make it around Drang-like. No matter how hopeless the rest of the world has gotten, you have this little area of people, and it makes you feel like you've made a tangible difference here. A point I've heard brought up against them is there's a lot of them, and they aren't really super deep or interesting. This didn't bother me so much because of, again, how many of them there are. Along with the fact, unlike in 3 and 1, many of them weren't on super important journeys for bigger purpose. They were just everyday people trying to get by in this land. So them not going on life or death adventures, which causes them to die, made sense to me. They found a safe place, so they stay there. That's all it is. Then we do still have our tragic NPCs like Lucatil, which is one of my favorite characters in the series, or Vengarl, who is, again, probably one of my favorites due to how cool he is. He's the only time I can think of recently where I sat through mountains of dialogue just to hear how interesting his past was. Due to DS2 being the longest Dark Souls game, it has an abundance of cool items and clothing, to where there's so many things for you to use and choose from, it would take you forever to go through them all. Fashion Souls is very subjective, so I don't want to focus on this point for too long, but I feel this game has the best drip out of any of the other Souls games. Most of the sets just work. You can mix and match many of the outfits and they'll still look great. You'd have to intentionally go out of your way to make a character that looks mismatched and ugly in this game. As for the weapons, there are so many unique weapons that never left this game, it's a crime. Things like beam swords, hurricane great swords, Street Fighter fist weapons, the fucking dual-wield Artorias flip. It's actually crazy how much variety there is here. Many weapons even have unique animations or unique power stance attacks, which I didn't even learn was a thing until way later. Since this was before DS3 nerfed pretty much everything, almost all the weapons you can get in this game are viable. So many of them I found weird unique applications for, and it feels great going through all of them to see what they can do. Many of the crazier ones drop closer to the end of the game, so they help carry this tangible sense of progression as you go on. And as a rarity, there isn't really one class you can feel that's missing out on content. Mages, archers, and your standard melee dudes can choose to main any weapon and they'll still feel like there are multiple options open for you, to the point where there's a lot of subclass types you could try too. And since this game will leave you a way higher level than the other two Souls games due to its length, you may be able to even dip into two classes at the same time. This game feels like it dove way deeper into the RPG side of things than the other two did, and it's greatly appreciated. Bosses in DS2 are a very divisive topic. Most of them are okay at best. Many regard DS2 bosses as horrible rejects in comparison to the rest of the games, but I don't see it this way at all. Many of them are mid, yeah, but to be frank, DS3 was the only game where a majority of the bosses were more than mid. DS1 only had 3 okay bosses that didn't turn like buses. Those being Gwyn, who can be parried to death, and Artorias and Manus, who are at the tippy end of the game in the DLC. DS2 has Fume Knight, Elan, and Burnt Ivory King. I don't see why it's such a pressing point to say that DS2's bosses are mid, when other than designs, DS1 suffered from the exact same problems. For me, the bosses in DS2 fill out the journey. They aren't pressing roadblocks of difficulty, but they help cement that feeling even further than everything else I mentioned. Fighting dragons, frog demons, knights, and whatever the rotten is just feels cool. It feels cool to fight all these fantasy bosses. Sure, I'd love it if they were on Gale's level, good move-wise, but them not being peak just wasn't really a concern for me. And since there's so many of them in this game, it leads to a lot of items, spells, and things I gushed over in the last section. It helps that some of the bosses have multiple items you can get from one soul, which gives you a good incentive to fight some of them 3 or so times. New game is a point I wouldn't really bring up in any of the other Souls games, mainly because you're replaying the same thing again. But DS2 changes as you go into new game. Not just once, but I believe up to 3 or 4 times the enemies in the area will change. This leads to there actually being new experiences in your repeated playthrough. If you thought the base areas were too easy, some here get filled with red phantoms or new enemy types as a whole, such as the Greater Undead. But then they will also get new moves, like the Falconer getting it's Falcon. I can guarantee you 99% of players got to new game and shat themselves seeing 3 strong enemies in the tutorial area. It keeps you interested on seeing how everything else changes. And I'm really upset this didn't transfer to any of the other games in this series, but oh well. DS2 had so many quality of life changes that no one seems to want to talk about. It's actually crazy. First of all, 360-degree rolling. I'll admit DS1 is the game I have the least amount of replays on, but every time I come back and I can only roll in 4 directions, my brain almost conks out. It's not the most pressing issue in the world, but it feels weird when you're holding a direction and your character just doesn't go that way. While minor, it helps smooth combat. Second, you can actually jump in this game. We weren't at the point of Elden Ring or Sekiro, where it's just a normal jump, but when you hit the button, your character actually springs forward. This is in contrast to the other game where your character kind of clumps slightly upwards and stops. Third, your character feels alive. I don't know how to word it exactly, but your character reacts to the state they're in. If their health is low, they'll hunch over. If they run out of stamina, they'll start panting. I have legitimately no idea how this wasn't ported into literally any other video game that they made, but it adds to the whole you are going on this journey deal. It's cool to see when you beat up a hard boss and your character seems to still be recovering from the engagement. Fourth, you don't have to beat the whole game to go in the new game. Bonfire Stacks will help you if you wanted to get a specific boss's second soul weapon or drop, or just a drop from enemies that don't respawn. Respecking. I don't know why Dark Souls tends to forget it's an RPG, but respecking just wasn't in the first game, which I think is the main reason I haven't replayed it much. There isn't really that much to add to this point because it's just something they slowly ironed out over time, with it even getting better in 3. You couldn't even re-customize your character until the 3rd game. And there's probably a few little other things I could go into at this point, but I'll stop here for that. Balanced power stancing. This is a point I wanted to bring up since Elden Ring decided to bring back power stancing. And note, I'm not saying all this to bash Elden Ring, as I like that game too, but since it's the only other game they made with this feature, I have to use it as a comparison. I feel power stancing was handled better here than it was in Elden Ring. As I mentioned earlier, some of the weapons give you access to unique power attacks, special moves, or etc., depending on what your weapon is on your other hand, which Elden Ring didn't do at all. I'm not saying it like it's some super deep thing, but it shows a nice level of care and detail. And despite people saying this point is a cop-out, having certain moves depending on your power stance can affect the way you play the game. I guarantee you anyone who's used the Bone Fist will entirely understand what I mean by this. Then there's the small detail where you can power stance smaller weapons with your bigger weapon. If you have a greatsword in one hand and a normal sword on the other hand, you can still power stance it. I'm sure it's good for certain builds, but I just think it looks cool as fuck. It's a nice little inclusion I appreciate. Then we have to talk about the more serious effect on gameplay power stancing has in these two games. In ER, there's literally no reason to not power stance. It's just better than any other option you have, unless your character weight becomes too much, which is mainly only a problem for greatswords and other huge weapons. In DS2, power stancing was a trade. You can shard out damage, but it absolutely destroys your stamina. I remember my first playthrough I used the Bandit Axe, and since I beat Elden Ring before this game, I assumed that when I'd get another one and leveled it up, I'd pretty much be able to destroy everything easily. But you can only swing the things 3 or so times before your character runs out of stamina. So I quickly learned to only power stance in certain situations, because otherwise, it's not just the best course of action. This effect also bleeds into PvP. As anyone who's played Elden Ring will most likely know, it's very easy to dual wield certain weapons and just mash out things with little consequence. In DS2, this just isn't much of a problem. The only time it is if someone's trying to trick one-shot you, but if they miss, they'd usually die immediately. I know I said I wouldn't go hard into what people say against this game, but at some points, I feel if I make this video and don't address them, I'm probably going to regret since I don't know what other excuse I'd have to talk about DS2 after this. Overlapping on the map. While I like the map, some people point out how it's nonsensical. like how Earthen Peaks goes up into lava, or the Drain Lake Castle goes down into the Shrine of Amano where you can literally see the sky. I get why it rumples people, as the other Souls games don't really have this problem, and some people see it as immersion breaking, but I don't see this as a game ruining thing. There's another problem I feel with it too, but I don't know if it's a common complaint. The areas just aren't big enough. DS2 has amazing set pieces at times, only for you to stay in the area for 20 or 30 minutes. I would have loved to stay in some of these areas longer, but I guess it wasn't in the cards. Hitboxes. A lot of people complain about the hitboxes in this game, and I can see why. It's very easy to get hit by the back of some attacks in this game, or the hitbox just feels like it stays way longer than it should have. I understand the complaint. I don't think it happens enough to the point where it's game ruining, but I could see it getting some cheap deaths off on you. But I think it came with the territory, honestly. Since DS1 has some weird hitboxes to it, and since this game is pretty much double or more its size, it was bound to have a few goofy hitboxes slip through the cracks. There isn't really a definitive comeback I have to this one other than I don't see it as super bad. ADP is the stat introduced and ended in DS2. It's the stat that affects rolling speed and item usage speeds. Most people say it's an unnecessary stat, which I'll just say they have a point. It is an entirely unnecessary stat. I'm not sure why they felt the need to add it, alongside the fact they didn't feel the need to point out how important this stat in the game is. That being said, a lot of people lean on this stat as the pressing issue that destroys this game, when I just don't find it that way. Once you get around 25 levels in ADP, your character will function like a normal Souls character. Above that, and you'll have one of the most busted dodges in the series, alongside super fast item usage. But if you go below that, you'll have the worst dodge in the game and very slow item usage. If you were stuck with low ADP for a majority of the game, I'd see it as a problem. But since this is the Souls game where it's the easiest to level up, you can hit 25 or more ADP once you get past the first area if you really wanted to and never have to worry about it again. Once you understand how it works, I don't find it to be the horrible system that absolutely ruins this game. Hell, some people, including me, just thought they made roll timings tighter and healing was slowed in general, and beat the game with base ADP anyway. Enemy ganks. One of the issues people have with DS2, but mainly Scholar of the First Sin Edition, is that there are enemies everywhere. 1 and 3 don't have anywhere near the amount of enemies that this game has, but I think it's all manageable as long as you're not speedrunning past enemies without a plan. Given most of the enemies in this game aren't exactly healthy or have fast, flashy attacks, beyond my first playthrough, I didn't die to them too much unless I did something stupid. Most of the time, if there's more than 1 or 2 enemies attacking you, they're either really weak or they have a gimmick. Of course, there are exceptions like the old Iron King's area in the DLC or the Shrine of Amana, but for the most part, I feel like the rules I said still stand. But I just find it different, not necessarily a flaw with the game. Just to tack one thing onto this point, there's also way more NPC invasions in this game, which made me actually use the Giant Seed, which I never really had a reason to use in the other games. It's fun to pop them and see all the chaos that happens from it. Life gems. Life gems are very controversial, and it's not really a one side's wrong and doesn't understand the intentions kind of situation. I think it's just genuinely a matter of opinion. Life gems do make healing way easier than it is in any of the other Souls games. You can hold 99 of them at a time, and as long as you don't get ragdolled in most of your encounters, you can walk off any situation in the game. And given ADP exists, it's not that hard to find opportunities to pop them in boss fights either. It made the game a lot more casual in that sense than the other two. Do I think someone new to a Souls game would get destroyed all the same? Yes. But for vets of this series, it makes sense that they'd complain about this. As I said, it's more of a difference in opinion thing than a fact thing. Combat speed. Combat speed's been slowed down. Your attacks, your stamina recovery, enemy attacks, all that has been noticeably made slower. 1's fights aren't exactly lightning fast, but they were relatively quick. And one of the main complaints people had about DS3 was the fact that the bosses went overboard on speed. 2 is slower than both of the games I previously mentioned, which isn't exactly a bad thing. If there were this many enemies attacking you at the speed DS1 or 3 did, the game would feel like a mod made by some 10-year-old. But since combat is overall slower and it's not just you, it feels like you can take in what's happening. Like the previous point I made, I feel like it's just a difference in opinion here. I still feel like it's Dark Souls. You're still learning attacks and punishing accordingly. You just have to be a bit more deliberate with what you're doing. In conclusion, DS2 is my comfort game. I understand it isn't perfect, but there's so many good and positive changes that the game made. To say it did nothing for this series would just be lying. As I mentioned, there's a lot of things that can and have divided how people think about this game. I don't blame people for saying it's not their favorite, but I feel I see a cartoonish amount of hate for it for no reason other than other people said so. And since it's the internet, I'm sure a good clump of people who say it's bad haven't even tried the game. Does it feel like it pushes certain different values than the previous games? Sure. Is it an absolute garbage garbage stain on the series? No, not really. While it is different, I'm happy they at least tried to make a unique experience, and I feel I'm not alone with that thought process. DS2 will most likely always be the black sheep of the franchise, but I feel for us who enjoy the game, being different and trying new things doesn't make it bad. I hope I may have changed a few minds about this game or made some people want to try it, but at the end of the day, I want to know what you guys think. As always, as long as you guys are respectful, I'm glad to discuss with you in the comments, and I've been M, and I am out.
Dark Souls 2 video. Okay. Not the only one that runs at 60 frames per second. Yeah, I was mainly only really playing Dark Souls 2 and Dark Souls 3 at the time, and Dark Souls 3 only runs at 30 FPS on console, and I hadn't played Dark Souls 1 in a while, but I guess I just misremembered it being 30 frames, so that's why I had said that. It is wrong, because Dark Souls 1 Remastered runs at 60, so that's my bad. I'll take the L on that. Rolling in the quality of life point. Yeah, I just said you could only roll in 4 directions, which I misspoke. What I meant to say is you can only roll in 4 directions if you're locked on Dark Souls 1. And in Dark Souls 2 and 3, it isn't like that. That's what I was trying to say. Weird mic quality. Yeah, this video almost shit itself because I had to compile it all at the end. And for some reason, it just made the audio quality go down like heavy. And I had to scramble the last minute to fix all of it together. I think it came out pretty well. It's still probably the weirdest sounding one out of all the videos, but if you guys heard what I heard initially, I was like, oh my god, I have to scrap the whole video. It's over for me. It's straight up over for me. It was crazy. The music was a bit loud. Yeah, I used to have an issue with music mixing because my microphone, I didn't know how to use noise reduction that well yet. So if I didn't have the music loud, you would just hear like the air noises in the background. So that was my compensation. What do I feel about Dark Souls 2 now? I still like it. The RPG mechanics make me feel like I always have something to build for that I've never done before, and that's kind of why I have all my character slots filled. The replayability with New Game actually adding new stuff is really cool, as there's a lot of stuff even now I haven't seen, and the general slower pace of the combat alongside having life gems to heal you makes me just feel nice and pretty relaxed in comparison to playing 1 and 3. 1 to which I don't like the entire end half of the game, and 3 which just doesn't have that replayability and build variety aspect I mentioned at the start. It's just a fun little time for me that I like to come back to every now and then.
Now I know a lot of you came from my DS2 video, which, thank you for that, because I didn't honestly expect that video to do so well. How could I? I'm sure with me saying I love DS2, you can assume I'm pretty interesting with my takes on the series as a whole. And I've never seen anyone talk about this game the way I feel about it, so today, that's what I'm going to be doing. I'm going to be talking about Dark Souls 3, my first in the Souls trilogy. While I'm not strictly a Dark Souls channel, since this is what got me and many others into the series, I feel like I have to give my opinion on it. As I said in the last video, I'm not going to blindly hate on this game, nor am I going to religiously praise it. I'm just going to give my opinion on it, and we'll see what happens from there. With all that out of the way, let's begin. The core gameplay of DS3 is the best out of all 3 games, period. DS1 only lets you roll in 4 directions. I personally think this was when it was at its worst. 2 was omnidirectional, but 2 was 2, so it was slower and it was affected by ADP. 3's rolling is snappy and fast, allowing you to have quicker combat encounters than the other 2 games did. The enemies and more so the bosses, as we'll get to later, are a lot more active in this game. For some reason, it took them this long to be able to turn towards you, in comparison to 1 and 2 where it felt like you were fighting mini-bosses at times, leading to an overall faster-paced game. You can actually re-customize your character. I don't know how it took us 3 games to come to this somewhat obvious point, but either or, I'm glad it's here. You can sell souls for the right amount. This was a stupid thing before, but if you sold souls, they wouldn't give you as much as if you had normally crushed them. This small fix definitely helps when you have tons of soul items stashed and you want to get through them all without manually using them. Hitboxes. Hitboxes are better for a Souls game. Contrary to popular belief, Dark Souls 2 isn't the only game with this issue. I'll still get clipped by funky moves here and there, but it's definitely not as much as a problem as it was in the other 2 games. Durability is pretty much not a problem anymore. Weapons will rarely break in this game, and they got rid of all the armor breaking effects some areas and enemies had. A point I don't see many people mention is durability's main use was to limit the amount of times you use some of the more unique weapons. The items most at risk of breaking were things with strong unique weapon skills in Dark Souls 1. Or in DS2 it was things with unique effects like the Hurricane or Lightning Greatswords. Since these now drain FP, there wasn't really much of a reason for it to also drain your durability, so it was pretty much nerfed to the point where you don't have to be worried about it. Oh my god, Dark Souls 3 bosses. They are the peak of the Soul series by far. The majority of them quality-wise outclass 1 and 2 bosses, and it's not even close. They're faster paced, they're snappier, and they require your full attention at all times. This is in comparison to the older games where for the most part, you could casually waddle around them so they'd spend half of the fight trying to turn towards you, alongside the fact that a lot of their attacks were heavily telegraphed, so dodging them wasn't really hard. A lot of them here are just so memorable. There's a reason a lot of people's favorite bosses in this game differ from person to person, and it's mainly because most of them are so good. Which, to bring in the old titles again, it would usually only variate from one of the 3 last bosses, and saying anything else would be considered an odd take. Hell, Gale alone here has made me replay this game multiple times for just how good of a boss he is. I believe he's one of the best boss fights in gaming, period. The setting of the fight, the fluidness of dodging and counterattacking him, it all just feels so good. Soul of Cinder is one of the coolest concepts for a final boss of a trilogy I've ever seen. He's an amalgamation of everyone you fought. Some characters you've met before, and most likely characters you played as in the previous games, alongside Gwyn, the one who started this entire thing. The twin demon princes, while I suck ass at their fight, are probably the best duo fight in the entire series next to Ornstein and Smough. Then there's Nameless King, who is Nameless King. And there's probably more I could go into, but I think you get my point. The bosses by themselves make this game worth buying. Somewhat related, and I find still worth mentioning, is Half-Life, who's probably my favorite player boss in the series. I did quite a lot of PvP here back in the day. Since this is basically doing PvP with a few tweaks, I'm pretty sure you could imagine why I like this. Though I think the balancing is a bit dumb as they made you a bit too squishy, especially considering the fact the other player has 8 or so Estises at this point. It's fun to be the main boss and stop people from progressing in the game. You get to be a part of someone else's journey as either the easiest or hardest boss in their run. And if you do it right, I'm sure you can leave an impression. And I'm pretty sure I did while recording footage for this section. As you can tell, I enjoy most things about the bosses in this game, but I still have to acknowledge some little icks I have about them. First, boss tails and limbs. In the first game, you could cut off boss tails for unique weapons and rewards. It was such a cool and rewarding mechanic. DS2 has the same thing, but it's significantly downgraded. So most of the bosses' limbs breaking really just limited their movesets a little bit, and you often wouldn't get items. And on the few rare occasions where you did, they wouldn't be anything special. DS3 just removed this entire mechanic as a whole. Why? Maybe it's because a majority of the bosses in DS3 are humanoid or kind of humanoid, so they didn't deem it worth the effort of coding in, but it was a small charming touch I'm sad we've lost. Then other than that, I want to talk about the bosses mechanically. As I said earlier, the base combat with bosses has been pretty much ironed out to perfection, which is why I find it weird how many gimmicky fights they have in this game. For example, I've made a quick list separating the gimmick fights from the more straightforward ones. You may have noticed a bit more than half of the fights in this game are gimmick fights. You may also notice most of the gimmick fights are the Lords of Cinder, some of which you can beat in about 2 minutes. Now, having gimmick bosses in themselves isn't a problem, but doing it in the game where you ironed out the one-on-one melee combat is such a weird choice. Don't get me wrong, these gimmick fights are still better than a majority of the DS1 and 2 bosses, but as I said in my last video, other than the last 3 fights of both games, I find them mostly mediocre in that regard. So that really doesn't mean much since I don't hold them in a high position anyway. To give my brief thoughts on the ones I feel more extreme about, Yorm Wolnir and Ancient Wyvern are wasted potential. For Yorm and Wolnir specifically, I kinda like their lore, so the fact that you can nigh instantly destroy them is disappointing. Abyss Watcher's first phase sometimes makes me want to tear my hair out, because it feels like you're waiting for the third one to wake up before you can really do anything. They can also do pretty heavy stagger to you, so it's possible that they can just insta-kill you sometimes. Aldrich and Crystal Sage are just genuinely unenjoyable. Say what you want about Dark Souls 1 and 2 bosses, I hate these two more than 99% of them. They just run from you and mash projectiles. I don't even really see what fun you can have with them. And when you go into higher new games, them having more health and damage makes this even worse. Deacons is Prowling Mages but slightly tweaked. They're better, but being better than shit doesn't really mean much. And then this next bit is a little off topic, but I still think worth mentioning in this section. I think Midir is overhyped and overhated, to be honest. Once you know you should hit his head, you notice he only has 3 or so attacks he'll usually do, none of which are hard to dodge, and 2 of them will either cause you to move away from him or make you have to chase after him. I think he's more of a boring fight, only given attention because of the fact his design's cool, alongside he has the most health and the ability to two-tap you in most circumstances. You may think I'm hypocritical for bringing this up after I didn't point out any specific bosses or things like this in my Dark Souls 2 video, but the difference is, as I said in that video, I don't find bosses to be the point of Dark Souls 2. Same thing goes for Dark Souls 1, although they were a bit better than it. Dark Souls 3's main focus does appear to be directly on this for reasons we'll get to later, so these really stand out. Especially, as I said like before, the rest are so good by comparison. The NPCs in Dark Souls 3 are a high point. Remember how in the last video I said I liked Lucatiel and Vengarl? Pretty much everyone has that same level of love and characterization those two had, if not more. I remember Henri and Horse's story made me feel pretty emotional when I first played it. Morn and his cleric story made me feel legitimately bad for my choices. Greyrat and Patch's quest made me feel anything for Patches, which is a feat in itself. I could probably list off every NPC in the game in this section, because they were just handled significantly better in this game than they were in the previous installments. DS3 completes a lot of small story arcs that were in 1, and very less so in 2. We get to see some of the characters we met in the other games' Fates. The Giant Blacksmith, Quilina, the Dark Moon Firekeeper, Gilligan. Then there are bigger things that reference the world, like multiple locations actually being previous locations from Dark Souls 1, just shifted and decayed by age. Even Dark Souls 2 got a small nod in the DLC. Although I wish there were more references to 2, since the ending of that game implied you and Aldia are both alive, and you have a crown that nullifies hollowing, which feels like it should have been a major event in the world. I'm quite happy with all the callbacks they chose to do here. Then of course there are the smaller things they brought back, like weapons and armor from the previous games. Many named differently due to the previous games technically being centuries ago. It's a nice way to include some fan favorite weapons. And for the lore guys out there, the item descriptions for all of these items have been changed from the previous games, most of which describing how these things lost importance as the eras went on, or a nod to how some events ended. Which, other than expanding on the previous games a bit, feels like what would realistically happen in these sorts of situations. Many old important items and weapons losing purpose in the Age's final stint. The music. Oh, the music. I wouldn't bring up music in any other Dark Souls game, because 1 and 2 only have a few standout tracks. But 3, the menu music alone is better than anything the other two games produced. This point is obviously subjective, but Gale's theme, Soul of Cinder's theme, Midir's theme, all of these are amazing. 3 is the best music out of the trilogy for me by far. I obviously can't make this section super long, but in the last video, I said music is a passing thing. If it's bad, you'll notice it, but if it's okay, most people aren't paying attention to it. DS3's music is so good, it's standout, and it feels like you almost have to notice it at some point playing this game. I'm pretty sure this is the game that made me appreciate game music in general. Hell, Half-Life, the player boss, has a better theme than a majority of Dark Souls 1 and 2 bosses. This is where the tone of the video might take a noticeable shift. DS3 did many things amazing. This was not one of them. Earlier you heard me mention that bosses were a key point of this game. They felt like the main focus, and a lot of surrounding aspects suffered for that. This was one of those things. Areas in Dark Souls 3 felt like they were put there because they needed to be for a Dark Souls game. I feel it's the main reason Dark Souls 2 having so many beautiful locations and 1 having so many unique ones caught me off guard, because Dark Souls 3 is so bland in contrast. Are there some pretty areas? Yes. Other than most of the boss areas, which look great. Irithyll and the Ring City come to mind, but other than those, I never really felt compelled to look over the world. The graphics themselves are obviously better since this game is on newer gen, but it's more of the area concepts in comparison to 1 and 2 feel a bit underwhelming. I understand the point of DS3 is the cycles are ending, but the areas just feel like they're missing something design-wise. After my first playthrough, I just pushed through them to get to where I needed to go, and I never really felt the urge to wander off to see what's around or even just look at the scenery. Even after coming back to it all these years later, the footage you see of me exploring areas is just because I needed to record a section of myself doing it, not because I naturally felt compelled to do it. Before I went out of my way to get it, I didn't even have footage of the areas before Deacons because I thought they were so uninteresting and I forgot to save recordings as I was just mindlessly going through them. If it's your first playthrough, maybe you won't notice, but anything after that, it feels noticeable, at least for me. The interactivity that Dark Souls 2 had is nigh completely gone, with only 2 examples I can think of, with that being Cage Guy and Bridge Midir, neither of which are really impactful. You'd think after all the innovations 2 did on that front, 3 would incorporate any of them, but no, it didn't. No exploding walls, no planning ahead, no burning windmills, nothing like that is in this game at all. Go forwards, hit boss, go forwards, hit boss, and that's pretty much it. Even though Dark Souls 1 wasn't interactive like 2 was, the areas were a bit larger to compensate and you had to go through them multiple times. They just didn't even try to do anything like that here. It's gone now and there wasn't really anything to replace it. The areas just feel like they had so little value to this game. After you beat the game once, sometimes you'll just wish it was a boss rush. Onto the enemies aren't really interesting here. There's no legit reason to fight the enemies here unless you're grinding for something. They won't follow you very far and they give up the second you're more than a few steps away from them. Most of them aren't even fast enough to catch you after one attack they may or may not do when you get close to them. They might as well be set dressing in most cases due to how easy it is to get around them. And then on top of that, there's the fact that this game's the most linear out of the three. So in most cases you can just run straight forward from where you spawned from or look for the obvious side path and you'll be fine. Which really doesn't help this point at all. 1 and 2 gave you a deterrent from doing this. 1's areas were more tight in many places, meaning that you couldn't just ignore them without risking big damage in return. If you ignored them and didn't have any plan to get out of the area, they'd most likely catch and kill you. 3 has no real way to stop you from just skipping everyone and going straight to the boss. For the most part, it's go through small area with skippable enemies, beat boss, and move forwards and do this on loop for the rest of the game. I'm not saying this as if it straight ruins the game or anything, but I kinda brain dead through a lot of it waiting to get to the boss part. Build creativity was shot dead in Dark Souls 3. If you're not a melee build in some form, you're just gonna have a vastly worse time than everyone else. Intelligence and faith have been neutered beyond belief here. In 1, pretty much every form of magic damage was blessed. In 2, it was toned down slightly, but you could still shard out damage. And if you couldn't kill a boss with just it alone, it would only take a few nudges from your weapon to finish them off. In 3 magic may as well be a challenge run because of how bad it was made here. Which is a real shame because it looks better than it ever has before. Since I have more experience with 2, I'm going to be using it for reference. In DS2, most forms of magic damage would insta-kill normal enemies and heavily damaged bosses. And all it would take is for you to level up your catalyst and magic stat of choice, and that would pretty much be it. In DS3, you'll need to dedicate your ring slots to it. You'll pretty much be forced to level up some other stats to wield the real weapon anyway, because the coating buffs on your weapons are way more effective and reliable than your little magic attacks by themselves. And on top of all that, the magics you use need to be the best possible variants of them, because otherwise, you'll need to spend a few casts to deal with just basic enemies. And against bosses, you'll pretty much be doing peanuts for damage. While before better magics just felt like an upgrade to your already solid kit, here they feel like necessities. Even if I gave you the benefit of the doubt and said after all that your magic does solid damage, it's still more effective to whack them with any melee weapon in 99% of cases. Disregarding the effectiveness of them, they simply took out some of the more fun, interesting magics you could do before. Power stancing is dead. It's just not a thing anymore. You know, the thing people who didn't even like the game said they thought was good. And it's funny they did this in the game with Pontiff, who would have literally been the best, most rewarding boss to beat twice to get both swords and then power stance for a similar moveset to his. And let's break it down even simpler. The creative weapons here are just bad. While recording footage for this video, I happen to beat Shira and get her weapon, the Crucifix of the Mad King, which is the most unique and downright bizarre looking weapon in the game. Remembering I was writing a section like this, I decided to use it, and let me break it down for you. The base moveset is that of the Hailbird. Nothing worth mentioning here, but I wanted to understand what this weapon's unique skill was, because to be fair, it looks really cool, as do many of them in this game. And this is where my disappointment grew immensely. So the skill is a slam into a scream. The scream will either give you poise, make the scream have a larger AoE, or it'll try and hurt you with a curse ball, which you can make hurt enemies if you're strategic enough. While this is the coolest weapon in the game and I think this effect looks cool, why would I go through with all of this? It's just not worth it when I can use my greater straight sword, both of which have less wind up, planning, or risk in using them. The curse orb I mentioned is nice damage wise if you can hit it, but it's hard to manage it and whatever is attacking. If you get hit or stuck in any sort of animation while it's about to blow up, you're eating about half health. The poise buff is okay in certain scenarios in PvE, but otherwise it's not worth RNG rolling for, and the scream is self-explanatory. It does damage and it's 99% of the time what you want, but again, it's not worth RNG rolling for when you could just use any other weapon in R1 for guaranteed damage. In PvP, this weapon somewhat serves a purpose as it has a 3-hit combo, but in every other aspect, it's just not worth using at all. all. And this kind of thought process applies to pretty much every other unique-ish weapon skill in this game. The reason a lot of these suck and have no value in everything except for PvP, as I said before, is because this is a boss-focused game. They won't flinch and get stuck in your 3-hit combo or weird quirky effect. And as I said before, for the enemies, the only thing you would use them on are so easy to kill normally or just run past here, you don't have any reason to go out of your way and use it on them. Alongside the fact that a lot of these drain FP now. So they drain a finite resource which wasn't even a mechanic before. I'd bring up the catalyst weapons or shields, but they don't exist anymore. And somehow, I'm still not done with this point because that's how bad things are here. In DS2, when I first stumbled into Iron Keep due to how many enemies there were, I wondered how I could aggro them. I decided to use a bow to hit one of them, and since I came off of 3, I assumed it would practically deal 0 damage and just annoy the enemy to attack me. But then I noticed it actually did decent damage, and it became an on and off part of my arsenal. My mostly unupgraded in comparison to the rest of my gear starter bow with no rings, no special arrows, or no crazy build did solid damage. I don't feel I need to go deeply into how flawed bows are here in Dark Souls 3, but they were so bad here, they conditioned me into thinking they were going to be absolute shit in the other 2 games to the point where I avoided using them. You have to let that thought really sink in. And then there's the fact that the area design in this game for the most part doesn't give you incentives to use them. In DS2 I only came into that scenario because it felt like the logical thing to do. In my entire replay of Dark Souls 3 for this video, that thought didn't come into my mind once. Here you just have to be a basic R1 Andy if you want to get the most damage and enjoyment out of these faster, more aggressive bosses. Some people say this was the sacrifice for the bosses actually being good. They had to lock you down into a simpler style of play, which I don't fully agree. You never cast a majority of the slower spells or do the slower attacks on bosses in the older games, because even though they were sluggish, they would still most likely stop you. But DS3's base is not built for those things to work, and the few simple magics that would work in boss fights like Fireball or Sunlight Spear were nerfed into oblivion. Shutting off options and making me play a game a singular way with little variations isn't the best for replayability. For 99.9% of the game, you roll R1, and that's it. You can variate from doing that, but most other options are just significantly worse. Power stancing's dead. Magic as a whole is pretty much dead except for weapon buffs. Areas don't get new enemy variations and setups like they did in 2. What reason do you have to replay this game? If you liked it once, you'd like it twice, I guess. To be fair, there's some boosted rings, and since boss souls give you 2 weapons in this game, there's that, you know, the thing in every other Dark Souls game. And a lot of them honestly don't even feel worth the effort of getting due to everything I discussed in the last section. There's nothing super unique to replay the game for. The only thing it has over Dark Souls 1 is you can respec, but since Dark Souls 1 had more build freedom anyway, your respec will most likely end up with you whacking dudes like you did before, just with a slightly different stick. Unless you really love the core gameplay loop or really want one of the other soul weapons a boss has, there's nothing for you here. There's also the obvious argument of if you missed anything, but that goes for every game with a new game feature, so I don't think that's even a point worth getting into. There's a lot of complaints I've heard about this game. While obviously it's not my favorite, I still think some of these more interesting takes should be looked into, and I think it'd be unfair if I didn't address them like I did in the last one. Boss speed. Bosses are faster than before, and I've heard some people say this ruined the bosses. This is subjective. I don't personally understand why I've heard this enough times where people seem to take this as a fact. If we ignore the build aspect, Dark Souls 3 boss fights for the most part are tight encounters of back and forths. Manus, Artorias, Fume Knight, Alan, all these fights were held as the peak of Dark Souls fights and followed this exact philosophy. Then when we get a game full of things like that, it's all of a sudden an issue? Again, this is a subjective opinion that varies from person to person, but I simply don't understand the argument. Healing while walking made the game easy. Dark Souls 3 is different from 1 and 2. In DS1, I felt most of my deaths came if I ran out or near ran out of Estus while trying to make it to the boss. It was more about managing when to use what you had. DS2 deaths usually came from getting into situations you couldn't recover from, like a gank from skipping past enemies with no plan. In DS3, since areas are pretty much skippable, running away and healing isn't super difficult. You'll only really die here if you miss time your healing when a boss is attacking. The reason I'm saying all this is because DS1 and 2 healing was mainly designed for recovering after engagements. The difficulty didn't come in using these things most of the time, it was just managing the recovery resources you had. In DS3, you're mainly healing while something is either aggressively running after you or about to attack you. Being able to move slightly isn't going to make much of a difference if you're fighting someone like Gale or Nameless King and mistime your Estus use. The games are designed differently, so this change just made sense to me. Too many dudes in armor. I've never understood this complaint at all. I mentioned all the bosses people consider good already, but just to make sure we can all see, I'll put them on screen. Do you notice only 2 of the best received fights are non-human, and only one of them isn't a humanoid? I don't even know what non-human or non-humanoid bosses people are referring to that were so good at anything but design that this became a point people casually say. The game is too easy and the easiest out of the 3. This point really doesn't have a definitive answer as it's very subjective. People love to fling this point around without understanding that all 3 games are built and focused on different things. If I handed someone who doesn't play these games a controller and asked them to defeat Nameless or even someone lower like Pontiff, I doubt they could do it. Same if you handed someone a controller or told them to go through Blight Town or Black Gulch. They probably wouldn't be able to get through it. Dark Souls 1 and 2 had you learn areas or how to deal with them. 3 still focuses on mastering things, just instead of areas, it's movesets. Once you learn either of these things, the games become significantly easier. So I don't understand why people lay on this point as much as they do as if it's an objective fact that this game's just easier. Dark Souls 3 isn't a bad game. I know some of you may think otherwise due to all I've said along the course of this video, but I don't hate this game. If I had to use any word, it disappointed me more than anything. It had all the building blocks to blow everything else out of the water. It could have had the area layout of 1, the area interactivity, concept design, weapon uniqueness, and replayability of 2, the armor designs of both, the build variety and unique magics out of both of the games, then ironed out a lot of the more glaring problems on top of having the best bosses in the series, and it probably would have been the best game ever made. But that's not the reality we live in. It honed in on one aspect and shined it to perfection, while leaving everything else to the sidelines. It's the literal opposite of Dark Souls 2. While some blind DS2 haters probably clapped like seals because of this, anyone who's actually played that game could most likely see why this is an issue. Dark Souls 1 was kind of a sweet spot between both games, as it had nice areas and decent combat. In my opinion, it did neither of these perfectly, but these aspects were balanced to the point where it wasn't a problem. Dark Souls 2 focused on its areas, exploration, and RPG mechanics. Dark Souls 3 then focused on its combat, controls, and bosses. And that's the problem for me. It hard shifted to the other side of the spectrum without any counterbalance. At the end of the day, gameplay is what most people care about. It's the main reason Dark Souls 3 is much more popular than 2. It focused on the safest aspect possible, but in doing that, it gave up anything else unique it could have had. There will be people who replay it disregarding that, but for me, there's nothing else of substance really here. So if you want anything else, you're gonna have to look anywhere else. This is why while I like DS3 and still don't have any major negative feeling towards it, after my initial first few runs through it, I've hardly touched it since. I love Gale, I love Solicitor, I love Nameless King. They're some of the best, but I have to muck through areas and do things I don't care about every time I want to fight them. It's not like the areas and enemies are horrible and I get angry every time I go through them. They're just something I autopilot through. If this game had a boss rush or something similar, I'd probably have dozens or more hours here, but that's not the world we live in. And that kind of reflects how I feel about this game in its entirety. It let me down in multiple aspects, and I could see it being even better, but that's not the world we live in. After going back and playing the first 2 games, there's so many things you can imagine they could have done with a final game of the trilogy, and they just didn't. As much as people love to hate on Dark Souls 2 for this same kind of thing of being different and letting down in some aspects, 3 is the end of the trilogy. This was the final Dark Souls game, and the fact that you have to just laugh and go, oh well, to all the potential that this game had, on top of its already great base is sad. Would I still recommend you play it? Absolutely. I'd even still recommend it for people who want to get into the series. As I said, the core gameplay loop will and has hooked in tons of people. There are many who won't care about all the things I said 3 sacrificed because that's all they need, as I've said before. Despite my disappointments, it's a great send-off to the series mainly due to 2 things. 1, how great Gale was, and 2, as limited as the areas were, getting to see some of these older locations alongside its NPCs one last time made it feel like a conclusion. No matter how you feel about this game, the way it's set up definitely feels like a conclusive ending to this series. The flames faded. The world of Dark Souls has finally come to a dark, quiet end with this game, and perhaps that's okay too. I would have preferred a hypothetical perfect game to end the trilogy, the pinnacle of everything the last 2 built up on, but I'm sure that's anyone with any series they enjoy. I don't think any particular Dark Souls game is perfect. They're all flawed, and I'm pretty sure all of them were rushed behind the scenes. But they all have aspects someone could enjoy, love, or hang on to the point where any of the 3 games could be someone's favorite, and I wouldn't really be surprised by it.
And I think that's what's really amazing about this series.
But anyways, I feel I've said my piece.
The Dark Souls 3 video. I think this is the one with the most like little mistakes in it. It makes me sad. Made the same lock-on point as I did in the Dark Souls 2 one. I don't know why I kept saying you could only roll in 4 directions in Dark Souls 1. I don't know why I kept saying it like that. I did put a little subtitle explaining the whole I meant it locked on thing. It just slipped out twice. Oh, funny Half-Life story. Yeah. When I was recording for this video, the Gears guy that you see for like 2 seconds in the recording, I ran into him for like an hour. So when you see him in the clip where he just gives up and I say something like, you can leave an impression on someone, I know I have. Me and that guy fought, I think, 10 times. And in the clip you see, he just gave up because I was dogging him. I was dogging him. It was so fun. Half-Life is so fun. I'll still hop on sometimes to this day just to play Half-Life. I think it is such a cool little system. The gimmick tier list. Do you understand that most of the comments I got initially on this video were about this stinky funk booty gimmick tier list? And the only thing that I need to say on it, I wish I flipped Gundyr and Tree Spirit. I don't know why I put Tree Spirit in non-gimmick and I put Gundyr and gimmick. I just, because in my head I was like, well, he has the puss and man thing, and there's not really that much different about Tree Spirit other than you have to like pop the bubble stuff. So, you know, that's what my thought process was. But I think if I made that now, I would have switched those two, and I probably would have saved myself a whole lot of headache. Also, some people were a little upset by the fact that I said gimmick, because when they think of the word gimmick in the Souls community, they think of like the Storm Ruler or something. When I said gimmick in this video, I meant it as in there's some other like entity or something really random that happens, right? Like, for instance, Abyss Watchers, the gimmick is there's 3 of them. Pontiff, the gimmick is he clones himself. Wolnir, he's like a big ass skeleton that you can 3-shot. Yorm, Storm Ruler. Grave Tender and Great Wolf, it's 2 of them. Plus some actually, because they're wolves at the start. Like, that's what I meant by gimmick fights. When I said non-gimmick, I mean the more like one-on-one fights like Gale, Solar Cinder. Those are the more straightforward fights. And I'm gonna get ahead of the curve and make an assumption that some people are gonna go like, well, why is Iron Dragon Slayer there? He's a one-on-one fight. For first phase, he is. In second phase, normally you kill him really fast, so you don't normally see it. But Iron Dragon Slayer has those pilgrim butterflies off to the side that will begin just shooting shit at you from off screen, and it's very annoying to dodge. And those are also other entities trying to get in the way of your one-on-one fight. So I put him in there too. I kind of wish I talked about it a little bit more in the video. Like, I wish I dived into that little explanation to separate them up. I quickly went over it, but I wish I talked about it a bit more. Called Igon Morn. Yeah, literally nobody picked this up, but I have creative integrity, and I caught that I made the mistake. So I should be like every other Dark Souls reviewer. I have integrity, and objectively, I'm a little better than you. No. The only reason I called him Morn was because I was like, oh, well, it's a Morn set, so clearly Morn is the guy wearing it, despite the fact that, you know, a lot of other armor sets don't have the name of the character that's wearing it. So yeah, that's a little oopsie on my part. I can't believe I made that mistake. It's such a random thing to mess up. Dark Souls 3 magic isn't that strong. This isn't a correction. I just want to discuss it a little bit more. I don't disagree with past me. For a majority of the spells in Dark Souls 3, they are not really that good, right? I think there's a handful of really good stuff like Crystal Soul Spear, the Black Flame Throwable, and the little combustion version. But other than like a certain few spells, and when I say spells, I'm including Faith, Intelligence, and Pyromancy, they just aren't that good. Like, a majority of them suck. Even look at some of the ones that came back. Wrath of the Gods used to be busted beyond belief in Dark Souls 1. You could just walk into a room and just go, and that would be it. If you use it in this game, it's like, the tickle monsters come by. Like, a lot of the abilities in this game are like that, and I think it's really unfortunate because Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 2, you had a lot of wiggle room with a lot of these spells. Dark Souls 1, I was using the basic lightning spear and straight up smiting DLC enemies. You know, Dark Souls 2, I would say magic was really effective throughout the majority of that game. Dark Souls 3, I don't really feel that. I feel like a majority of the builds, unless you know exactly what to do, what rings to use, and what specific ability you want to be really strong, they just don't feel that great, you know? But that's my stance on that whole aspect. I said quite confidently, I may add, that there are no catalyst weapons in Dark Souls 3. There are. I never found them, I guess. And the Demon Scar, I know some people are like, the Demon Scar is literally in front of your fucking face in the boss soul thing, you dick. How did you not see it? I don't think I ever used it. Like I said, for the most part, if you're not fully spec'd into magic into like one super good option, it's usually better to just use the melee weapon. I came to that realization a while ago, so I was just using melee weapons and I didn't really think about the Demon Scar other than it looked cool. But yeah, there are catalyst weapons. They're just not as good, you know, like even the Demon Scar. The Demon Scar is significantly weaker than both the normal Pyromancy Catalyst and Parting Flame, which kind of snuffs out a lot of those abilities that you could use, right? Like I tried to use the Black Flame Combustion and just the normal Black Flame, and they were weak enough to the point that I was like, you know, I could just hit him. So then I just did that. I don't want it to sound like I'm deflecting. Let me make it clear, I'm not. I can accept that I got this catalyst point wrong, but on a separate related point, I would say that I feel that like magic and stuff is pretty weak unless you spec everything into making it really strong. And using these catalysts for me doesn't really feel worth it. Yes, I can cast a little bit faster, but the damage fall off just isn't really worth it to me here. Recustomizing was only in DS3. Now, this is a point that I just worded weird. It's not necessarily wrong, but I kept getting the comments so much, I feel like I have to throw it in here. When I said recustomizing your character, I meant customizing like their face, their hair, the eyes, stuff like that. That was just not a thing you could do until DS3. In DS2, you could respec, and in DS1, you know, that's what I had meant by that statement. It was the only game where you could also recustomize your character alongside allowing you to respec. I don't think I was clear enough, so hopefully now that this is out, I won't get that comment anymore. Next, we gotta talk about my creative weapons point, because I unfortunately chose the worst example possible, apparently. So my point here was that a lot of the creative weapons just aren't that good, and for the most part, I do think that's true. I just happen to choose the one with the weirdest way to make it good, right? So Crucifix of the Mad King isn't actually that bad. It does dark damage, which not a lot of enemies have resistances to. And once you get Dark Blade, if you mash the L2, it does like a truckload of damage. Now, this isn't the way that I was thinking of using it, because it's not exactly the straightforward way of using the weapon. However, that does exist. That is a thing that you can do. I wish that I didn't use that weapon in particular. I wish that I had said something like Valor Heart or like Wolnir Sword or something like that. I just happened to land on the worst possible denominator because I landed on the one weapon that actually does have a pretty good use when you know how to use it. How do I feel about Dark Souls 3 now? The same way. I think it is a very cool game. I think it is a very fun game. I think that when you're fighting the bosses, it's like, okay, I'm in this nice little flow state. It's not as, now that I've played a lot more Elden, I think I do prefer Elden bosses more because there's a lot more, this is gonna sound really nerdy. This is gonna sound, I'm gonna bring up another Souls-like. Remnant 2 is a Souls-like where there's really no downtime, right? It feels like you're always hitting the boss or they're always like attacking you and you're reacting. Like there's always an active moment in the fight, right? Elden Ring is kind of the same way because Elden Ring bosses, they tend to have gap closers or like an AoE move that can catch you. In Dark Souls 3, the bosses are fast, but they always feel like they have that super obvious opening where you're like, okay, now I hit them. They'll go like 1, 2, 3, your turn. You know, I feel like it's cool. I think Dark Souls 3 is a comfort game. Like I could run up and play it now and I'll probably be fine. I kind of have been recently, but it's just the fact that it came after 1 and 2 and it dealt away with so much of what 1 and 2 did. I can't say it's my favorite. It's cool, chill game, but it's missing too much for me to just jump out of my seat and like hold it up like a hero or something, which really sucks. It is what it is. That's been all the Souls videos with some of my new updated takes to add a little bit of new value. As always, as long as you're respectful, I'm glad to discuss with you in the comments. I'm trying to grow. If you subbed, that would be cool. I would like that a lot. I'd hope to see you again. And I've been M, and I am out.